and wisdom and lovable folks throughout. Sorry to see it ended. So we have a very accomplished scholar who's also our neighbor who is going to address us on the Congregational Church. And Professor Jaeger, if you'd like this, would you like this? Would you like to stand or sit? Or, yeah.
Can you hear me without this?
No.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Does this work?
Yeah, even closer.
About this near? Should I be? I'm
Yeah.
whispering now. Can you hear me now? There was a slight misunderstanding about my being invited here, I think.
Closer the better.
Closer. I should hold it.
Why would you?
Okay. Anyway, I was invited to come here, and then in subsequent emails with Mr. Ullman, it turned out that he was also expecting Grace, my wife, to come as well and be part of this conversation. I hadn't anticipated that, and I had no authority to tell her that she had just been invited or accepted an invitation to speak in Antrim, so I didn't tell her. Thinking that perhaps that was the better part of valor, but she found out about it this morning in church when this friend of ours, the one who's walking in, this couple are friends of ours from Washington. They're the Newbachers, and they had the generosity to mention in our worship service this morning that I would be here this afternoon. And that's when Grace heard about it, that she was going to be speaking in Antrim. In any case, I had done a little bit of thinking during the summer about what I might like to talk about. And so, not to disturb the ecology of our preparation too much, I did invite her to come, and she is going to say a few things by way of introducing some of the background work that we've done that's relevant to our basic topic. Were we just told about the topic? Did you mention? We're talking about the Congregational Church in New Hampshire today. In any case, I'm just rattling along here while your audience assembles. They obviously didn't want to
You are a
listen to
draw.
you.
You are a draw. They're coming in. They're coming in from Bennington, Francistown.
Good. What's really going to happen now, though, I'm going to turn this microphone over to Grace, and she's going to say some introductory things, and then I'm going to talk for a while. So right now, I'm going to hand this over to Grace. You saw that I lugged in a bag of, it's not bricks, it's actually books, and she's going to remind all of us, and me especially, that much of the work that we have done is really what we have done, not just what I have done. So that's a good reason for her to explain why she's got this stack of stuff in front of her and why she's going to get the microphone right now.
Thank you. And I first want to say to Mr. Ullman, he's a great researcher. Maybe it's all because of the web, but my goodness, the stuff you turned out about us. And somewhere you found out something about the Harvard Library Bulletin, which expired in 1962. Anyway.
Mr. Jaeger was an editor of the Harvard Library Journal.
Well, I was, yeah, okay, for one issue. But anyway, we won't go into that, but that's way back when. Can you hear me? Is it all right? Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about, as Ron said, congregational churches in New Hampshire. Now, Ron's the real intellectual in the household. I'm a good researcher, and I do things of that sort. But I've also been an elementary school teacher for 21 years, and so on. So, but he's the real scholar here. He's the one with the degrees. Anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our coming into the New Hampshire Congregational Church. Congregational churches are not part of our background. I'm from the same Dutch Calvinist background that Ron is. And as Mr. Ullman said, Calvin College back in Michigan obviously has some theological connections. And so we both went there. It's where we met. So congregational churches were not part of our background, but when Ron was a graduate student at Harvard, we attended the University Church, which is a congregational church. When he went to teach at Yale, we attended their Battelle Chapel, which is a congregational church. And so we had those two connections, and our son was baptized at Battelle Chapel. But our real connection with the New Hampshire Congregational Church came after we had bought the abandoned house in Washington almost 50 years ago. And we decided that we ought to go to the local church, and it was open in the summer, and that was the only time we were really there, and we thought we should attend. So we pulled up in our Volkswagen bus and parked on the green, and as we got out of the car, we were greeted by a woman who said, "Oh, good, we'll have a crowd today." So that sort of gave us a notion of quite how active the Washington Congregational Church really was. Anyway, I think there were probably 15 of us in the church, and this was the height of the summer. And in Washington, that means when there are more people than any other time. Anyway, that was our rub with the Congregational Church. We settled in, and the first thing, not the first, but after a number of years, we were struck by the fact that Washington didn't have an up-to-date history. Now, this was back in the 70s, and their last history had been published in 1886. So we got into the idea of writing a history. Wouldn't that be fun? And we could combine our talents and put together a history. Well, of course, that involved using the church as one of the great pivots of that history. And so in Portrait of a Hill Town, which is a big, long history of Washington from 1876 to 1976, there is a substantial section on the Congregational Church. Then from there on, Ron I was busy having the health insurance as I taught, and he did a book on the Meeting House, which was the original church, Congregational Church in Washington, and that was on the Meeting House in Washington. He also wrote a big section on the architecture of New Hampshire meeting houses in the book that was published for the 200th anniversary of the New Hampshire Conference called Granite and Grace. And also together we did what Mr. Ullman carefully mentioned before. Back in the 1980s, the New Hampshire Historical Society requested that we write the text for the history of New Hampshire. An illustrated history, which we did in the 80s, and there was a new edition brought up to date in 2000, and that was this edition, and a long section in there also of the congregational churches. So I'm going to read just a little tiny bit, and then I'm going to turn things over to Ron. I have no idea what he's going to say. He hasn't told me, but this is an introduction to whatever he says. Okay, it says this beginning of, New Hampshire, I think the advertisement or the listing in the community calendar said this was on the Congregational Churches of New England. Well, it's not. It's on New Hampshire, and if you care to walk out now, we'll understand. But the fact is that the history of New Hampshire churches is very similar to the rest of New England, but also somewhat different. Idiosyncratic, as all New Hampshire is. But, Massachusetts and Connecticut, there were Puritans and Pilgrims and things. New Hampshire wasn't quite so high-minded when it was founded. It was basically founded for more commercial reasons, and also there were Anglicans that were probably the first religious people in New Hampshire, not Congregationalists. But the Congregationalists moved in very fast, and by the time of the Revolutionary War, there were nearly 120 organized churches in New Hampshire. 84 were Congregational, 2 were Anglican, 15 were Presbyterian, 11 were Baptist, and 5 were Quaker. And there were a couple of other denominations here and there, but that shows you that is, the majority were Congregationalists, even though I think they've left Antrim by now, right?
Well, some of us have stayed.
Yeah.
Oh, you're still there,
They brought me back.
okay. Okay. So anyway, with that little bit of personal recollection and a little bit of introduction to how we got into this, I'm going to come and sit down there and leave the microphone to run. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the last thing we did. On the 225th anniversary of the Washington Congregational Church, we wrote a book called A Cloud of Witnesses, which is a history of our church. And I was proud of the little bit at the end. I know you read all this history, and you say, but what was it really like when you went to church there? So at the end of this, we have a little section on exactly what it's like to go to church. Who opens the church? What happens as we go through the service? And we thought that was a kind of neat way. Maybe in the future somebody will read this book and say, oh, that's how they did it then. Anyway, this is Ron shows himself. Here he goes.
Grace said she didn't have any idea what I was going to say, and I haven't told her. And I didn't have any idea what she was going to say either. So that's the way teamwork works sometimes. When I was invited to come, it was, as I understood it, about whatever I chose to talk about within the long history of the New Hampshire congregational churches. That's a 400-year-long period. And how to choose what to say in that context. I want to tell you that though I didn't do it quite this way, it's as if I looked at that 400-year-long history and imagined it as stretched out in a timeline, and I took a dart and I tossed it toward the center, and it landed bang on 1800. And then I took another mental dart and tossed it toward that timeline, and it landed on 1820. And another, and it landed on 1840. And I thought, now those are pivotal points wherein we might be able to ask and possibly provide some tentative answers to the question, what was interesting and important and central, or at least deeply involved in the life of congregational churches at each of those moments? In 1800, dead center of our long 400-year-old history here. And I thought I could identify the issue that was central and that animated and that was part of the fiber and interest of the church at that moment. And with respect to 1820, I thought the same thing. I believe I can identify what is interesting and important at that moment, and with 1840. So that's what I did, and now I'm going to presume, by way of summary of what I'm about to say, give you what I took myself to have discovered as this one-word answers to each of those questions. What was important in the congregational churches in New England in 1800? My single-word answer is the issue of discipline. Discipline, you know, has the very same root as disciple. Discipling within the church, discipline within the church. 1820, what was the major issue? What was it that summarizes what was important for the life of the churches? The answer to that question, to me, is church and state relations, town and church relations. And the crucial phenomenon that happened at that moment, namely the New Hampshire legislature passing the Toleration Act. And in 1840, my one-word answer to the question, what was important and exciting and interesting and valuable for the perspective of the people at that time, in one word, it was congregational church architecture. Now, those are my three answers, and I'm going to talk briefly about each of those. And that will give me what I'm going to pretend is an excellent outline for saying almost anything that I want to say. Before I start saying it, can you hear me all now? Am I audible? If not, raise your hand, cup your ear or something, or leave. I said the issue was discipline in the broad sense, a very broad sense of discipline. But remember, New Hampshire's congregational churches are, in effect, the established church, not officially, but actually. It's the church which the legislatures all had in mind in New England and in New Hampshire when they said it's important, as important for the life of our communities as education is the life of piety and morality, namely the churches. Schools and churches have to be supported by the government, automatic. Everyone's assumption, laws in all New England states, you must support education, you must support religion. That's how it happened, of course, that most of these were Protestant pilgrims and Puritans, and therefore it happened almost automatically.